At 8 in the morning on December 23, 1944, the sky over the Ardennes did something the German High Command had been told it would not do for at least another 5 days. It cleared. The fog that had hung over the forest valleys of Belgium and Luxembourg for an entire week began to thin. The low grey ceiling that had pressed down on the fir trees lifted. A bright, brittle winter sun broke through, and the air grew suddenly, painfully cold. In 100 farmhouses across the front line, civilians stepped outside, looked up, and crossed themselves. In foxholes near Bastogne, half-frozen American paratroopers stared at the brightening sky with disbelief. And on the snow-covered roads winding through the Eifel Hills toward the Meuse River, German tank crews looked up too. They had been promised, by their own meteorologists, that this sky would stay closed. The fog had been their cover, the fog had been their hiding place. Now there was no fog, and the day belonged to the men with the airplanes. Within hours, the first contrails would appear high above the forest, then the deep drone of engines, then the dive of fighter bombers onto roads packed bumper to bumper with Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, fuel trucks, and men. The Wehrmacht's last great offensive of the war, an operation built almost entirely upon a forecast of bad weather, was about to die in plain sight under a clear winter sky. This is the story of why the Germans regretted counting on bad weather at the Battle of the Bulge. Operation Watch on the Rhine, in German called Wacht am Rhein, was Adolf Hitler's last serious attempt to change the course of the Second World War in the West. By the autumn of 1944, the strategic position of Nazi Germany had become catastrophic. In the east, the Red Army was on the Vistula River, gathering for what everyone in Berlin understood would be a winter offensive of overwhelming weight. In the west, Allied armies under General Dwight D. Eisenhower had crossed France in 3 months, liberated Paris on August 25, taken Brussels on September 3, and reached the German frontier itself. The vaunted West Wall, the line of bunkers along the Reich's western border, was already being probed at Aachen. For most of the German general staff, the war was lost. They wanted to husband what remained of the army, fight a defensive battle, and hope for a political miracle. Hitler did not agree. On September 16, 1944, at his East Prussian headquarters known as the Wolf's Lair, Hitler interrupted a routine briefing. He pointed at the map. He chose the same forested, supposedly impassable region of Belgium and Luxembourg through which his armies had stunned the world in 1940. He chose the Ardennes. His plan was breathtaking in its ambition. 3 German armies would punch through the thinly held American line in the Ardennes. They would cross the Meuse River within 4 days. They would race north and west to seize the great Belgian port of Antwerp, the lifeline of Allied logistics. They would split the British 21st Army Group from the American forces to the south. They would, Hitler insisted, encircle 4 entire Allied armies, force a negotiated peace in the west, and then turn every remaining division eastward against the Soviets. It was, on paper, an operation worthy of 1940. There was only one problem. It was not 1940 anymore. The Wehrmacht of late 1944 was not the Wehrmacht of the Spring Blitzkrieg. It had bled itself white in Russia. It had lost an entire army group at Bagration in the summer. Across all fronts, the Reich had lost roughly 1.2 million men in the catastrophic months of June, July, and August 1944 alone. The heaviest losses in its history. The Luftwaffe, once the master of European skies, was now a broken instrument, hoarded for one final blow. Most decisive of all, the Allied air forces by December 1944 enjoyed a degree of air supremacy that no army in history had ever faced. Above the Western Front patrolled 4 enormous air organizations, the United States 8th Air Force, with its thousands of heavy bombers, the United States 9th Air Force, the largest tactical air force ever assembled at that time, with thousands of aircraft and around 200,000 personnel, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command, with its night bombers, and the Royal Air Force 2nd Tactical Air Force, with its rocket-firing Typhoons and its Spitfires. On any clear day, these forces could throw thousands of fighter bombers across the front in waves that German soldiers had a single short word for: Jabos, Jagdbombers, Hunter bombers. Wehrmacht commanders knew, from their bitter experience in Normandy, what a clear sky meant for a German tank column. It meant death from above. It meant tigers turned into burned-out wrecks on country roads. It meant supply trucks erupting in flame. It meant officers and men cut down as they ran for the ditches. Field Marshal Walter Model, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, General Hasso von Manteuffel, and General Sepp Dietrich, the four senior commanders who would actually have to execute Hitler's plan, all knew the same brutal truth. Their offensive could only move while the Allied air forces could not. So Hitler's planners did something that had never been done before in modern war on this scale. They built an entire strategic offensive around a weather forecast. The German Weather Service, the Reichswetterdienst, prepared the prediction the High Command needed to hear. Their meteorologists studied the climatology of the Ardennes in winter. They tracked the movement of air masses across the North Atlantic and Central Europe. And they produced a forecast that called for an extended period of low cloud, persistent fog, and heavy overcast over the Ardennes and southern England, lasting at minimum 5 days, possibly longer. 5 days of weather in which Allied fighter bombers could not fly. 5 days in which the panzers could move on the roads. 5 days in which to reach the Meuse. That forecast was not a fortunate side note in the planning. It was a precondition. It was, alongside surprise, speed, and the capture of intact Allied fuel depots, one of the 4 pillars on which the entire offensive was built. Without it, every German general in the room agreed, the operation could not work. With it, they would have a chance, perhaps as low as 10% in Field Marshal Model's grim private estimate, but a chance. The original assault date had been late November. It slipped to November 27. It slipped again, mostly because the divisions could not be refitted in time, and because Hitler's stockpile of roughly 5 million gallons of precious fuel still felt too thin. The High Command waited. They waited for divisions, for fuel, and above all, they waited for the meteorologists to confirm the right window. When the forecast firmed up at the start of December, the order went out. The new date for the offensive was set, 5:30 in the morning, December 16, 1944. To make this gamble work, Germany scraped together the last great striking force she could field in the West. 3 armies under Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B. On the northern wing, the strongest of the 3, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, with the elite Waffen-SS armoured divisions, the 1st SS Panzer, the 12th SS Panzer, the 2nd SS Panzer, and the 9th SS Panzer. In the centre, the 5th Panzer Army under the highly competent Hasso von Manteuffel, with veteran formations like the 2nd Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division. On the southern flank, the weaker 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger, screening the long left side of the advance. In total, more than 200,000 troops in the initial wave, building toward roughly 410,000 committed across the campaign. Around 1,400 armoured fighting vehicles, of which roughly 1,000 were true tanks. The heavy spearhead included around 45 King Tigers, the 70-ton monsters of the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, supported by Tiger Ones in other formations, around 400 Panthers, hundreds of older Panzer IVs and assault guns, and Jag Panthers and Jag Panzers in the tank destroyer battalions. 1,600 artillery pieces and rocket launchers were arrayed across the 80-mile front. About 5 million gallons of fuel sat in carefully hidden dumps in the Eifel Hills, an amount the Wehrmacht's own logisticians estimated would carry the panzers only a third to a half of the way to Antwerp under combat conditions, the rest of the journey being entirely dependent on capturing American fuel dumps intact. It was, in every sense, a desperate concentration, and it was being staked on a forecast. Across the Ardennes, on the other side of the line, sat the Americans. The 80-mile stretch of the front through the Ardennes was held by Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps of the United States First Army, under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, in turn under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. The Americans had a name for this sector. They called it the Ghost Front. It was a quiet stretch, a place to which divisions were sent either to rest after a battering, like the 28th Infantry Division, mauled in the Hurtgen Forest, or to be broken in gently, like the brand-new 106th Infantry Division, in the line just 5 days when the storm broke. Doctrine called for no more than 5 miles of front per division. The 106th Infantry Division alone was holding more than 21 miles, more than 4 times the recommended frontage. It was a calculated risk, taken because Eisenhower needed troops elsewhere, and because no one expected Hitler to attack here, in winter, through the same forest the Germans had used in 1940. Allied intelligence, which had been so spectacularly successful elsewhere thanks to the breaking of German codes, was largely blind. The Germans were using buried telephone lines inside the Reich, not radio, so the listeners at Bletchley Park had nothing decisive to report. There were warning signs. American patrols heard tank engines in the woods at night. They reported them. The reports were filed, considered, and discounted. The forecast at Allied headquarters was for a quiet Christmas in the Ardennes. December 16 began like any other day on the Ghost Front. In Bastogne, in St. Vith, in Malmedy, in the small Belgian villages along the Our and Sauer rivers, men woke in cold huts and pillboxes. Cooks lit stoves. Sergeants checked outposts. New replacements wrote letters home and stamped their boots in the snow to keep their feet warm. Some men of the 106th Infantry Division still had not been issued winter overcoats. Many wore wool, olive drab uniforms and leather combat boots, the same uniform they had landed in France in. The temperature was already well below freezing. Snow lay deep on the firs and beaches of the Ardennes, and the forest sat in a thick, grey, motionless fog. There was nothing in that fog but ravens and silence. Then, at exactly 5:30 in the morning, the silence ended. 1,600 German guns and rocket launchers opened fire along the entire 80-mile front. On Sepp Dietrich's sector to the north, the barrage rolled for 90 solid minutes. Whole American positions disappeared in geysers of frozen earth and splintered timber. Field telephone wires were sheared. Communications collapsed. Division headquarters in towns miles behind the front shook with the concussion of guns they could barely hear over their own walls. German railway artillery, firing from positions inside the Reich, sent enormous shells deep into the American rear, hammering road junctions, supply dumps, and command posts as far back as Liège. On Hasso von Manteuffel's sector in the centre, the artillery was shorter and more selective. Manteufel had argued, against Hitler's wishes, that a long bombardment was a relic of the First World War. Instead, his assault troops infiltrated forward in the pre-dawn dark, lit by the bounce of huge searchlight beams off the low cloud, an effect his men called artificial moonlight. They came out of the fog already among the American outposts. For the men of the 106th Infantry Division on the Schnee Eifel, a high forested ridge that jutted into the German line, the consequences were swift and catastrophic. 2 German infantry divisions executed a textbook double envelopment around the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments. By the morning of December 17, German troops were across the bridge at Schönberg in the Americans' rear. 2 American regiments, with all their attached artillery, were trapped on the high ground. They tried for 2 days to break out, without resupply, without air support, in deep snow. On the afternoon of December 19, Colonel Charles Cavender of the 423rd, and shortly afterward, Colonel George Deschneaux of the 422nd, after exhausting their ammunition, surrendered. Approximately 7,000 American soldiers became prisoners of war on the Schnee Eifel. Some sources put the number even higher, perhaps 8,000 or 9,000. It was the second largest mass surrender of American troops in the entire Second World War, second only to Bataan. The official United States Army history would later call it the most serious reverse suffered by American arms in the European theatre of operations. To the north, the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army drove a column known as Kampfgruppe Peiper down narrow Belgian roads. It was led by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, an aggressive young Waffen-SS commander with around 4,800 men, roughly 600 armoured vehicles, including approximately 30 operational King Tiger heavy tanks from the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, plus Panthers, Panzer IVs, and a long tail of half-tracks and supply trucks. On the morning of December 17, near the Borgnez crossroads, 2 miles southeast of Malmedy, Paper's lead element ran into a small American convoy of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans surrendered after a brief firefight. Around 140 soldiers were herded into a snow-covered field. Then the SS men opened up with machine guns. American soldiers playing dead were finished off with pistol shots to the head. 84 American prisoners were murdered at Borgnez. About 43 escaped. crawling and running through the snow toward Malmedy to tell the story. On the same day, near the Belgian hamlet of Wereth, 11 African-American artillerymen of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion were captured, tortured, and murdered by men of the same SS division. The Wereth 11, as they would come to be known, were buried in the snow and forgotten for decades. The news of the Malmedy massacre spread along the American front faster than any radio bulletin. By the afternoon of December 17, every GI in the Ardennes knew that the Germans were shooting prisoners. The effect was the opposite of what the SS intended. Surrender became unthinkable. The will to resist hardened into something cold and absolute. For the German planners, the first 3 days of the offensive looked, on the map, like success. Their armor punched bulges into the line that gave the battle its enduring American name. They split American formations. They captured prisoners and ground. But beneath the surface of the map, things were already going wrong. The 6th Panzer Army on the northern shoulder ran straight into the freshly arrived 2nd Infantry Division and the green but tenacious 99th Infantry Division on a stretch of high ground called Elsenborn Ridge. There, the Americans, dug into rocky positions, supported by tremendous artillery, simply refused to break. The 99th Division alone lost more than 460 killed and many thousands of wounded and evacuated, but they inflicted casualties on the attacking Volksgrenadiers and SS Panzergrenadiers at a ratio that approached 18-1. The northern shoulder of the Bulge held. Dietrich's main effort, the route Hitler had personally chosen, was already broken before the first week was out. On the southern shoulder, near Echternach, the veteran 4th Infantry Division held against Brandenberger's 7th Army with similar stubbornness. The flanks of the Bulge would not give way. The Germans were being squeezed into a long, narrow corridor between hard-pressed but unbroken American troops on either side. The second crisis hit the German fuel plan. Piper had gambled that his column could capture intact American fuel dumps as it moved west. The single biggest dump in his line of advance lay at Francorchamps, near the Spa headquarters of 1st Army. On December 17, an American major named Paul Solis of the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion ordered around 124,000 gallons of fuel cans poured out and set on fire across the road in front of Paper's tanks. A wall of flame, fed by burning gasoline and snow, blocked the route. The dump itself was saved. Paper had to find another way. He never found enough fuel. Eisenhower, at his headquarters in Versailles, understood by the evening of December 16 that this was something far more serious than a local spoiling attack. By December 17, he had committed his only theatre reserves, the elite 82nd Airborne Division and 101st Airborne Division, refitting near Reims after Operation Market Garden. He sent the 82nd north to Werbermont to seal the upper shoulder. He sent the 101st south, at maximum speed, in trucks through the night, to a small road junction in the Ardennes where 7 hard-topped roads converged. The town was called Bastogne. On December 19, in a cold, smoky French barracks at Verdun, heated by a single iron stove, Eisenhower convened his senior commanders. Bradley was there. Devers, Patton, and Bedell Smith were there. Eisenhower opened the meeting with words that would echo through every subsequent history. He said the present situation was to be regarded as one of opportunity, not of disaster, and that there would be only cheerful faces at this conference table. He turned to Lieutenant General George S. Patton, whose 3rd Army was attacking eastward into the Saar, and asked how soon Patton could disengage, swing his army 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the southern flank of the Bulge. Patton, who had already secretly ordered his staff to begin the planning, replied that he could attack the morning after tomorrow with 3 divisions. There was, for a moment, silence in the room. Then Eisenhower told him to take a little longer. The decision shaped the rest of the battle. Patton's 3rd Army began one of the most extraordinary logistical feats of the war, a full-scale 90-degree wheel of more than 100,000 men in winter weather. They drove north through ice, fog, and snow with a single mission, to cut a corridor to Bastogne. By December 20, the 101st Airborne, with elements of the 10th Armored Division and the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion under temporary command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was inside Bastogne. By December 21, they were surrounded. The The Germans of the 47th Panzer Corps under General Heinrich von Luetwitz had encircled the town, intending to capture or destroy the garrison and clear the road junction so the panzer columns behind them could pour through to the Meuse. On the morning of December 22, 4 German officers approached the American lines south of Bastogne under a white flag. They carried a typewritten ultimatum from von Luetwitz. The note demanded the honorable surrender of the encircled town within 2 hours. If refused, it threatened the total annihilation of the American garrison by, in the document's words, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions. The note was carried back to McAuliffe's command post at the Heinz barracks. McAuliffe was sleeping, exhausted, on a cot. His acting chief of staff woke him. Half asleep, McAuliffe at first thought the Germans had come to surrender. When he understood that it was the other way around, he muttered a single word and dropped the paper on the floor. The word, witnessed by every officer in the room, was, "Oh, nuts." When his staff began debating what an appropriate written reply might be, his operations officer suggested, "What you said initially would be hard to beat." So McAuliffe sat down and dictated the most famous American answer in the history of the war, 4 lines on a sheet of paper, to the German commander, NUTS, the American commander. Colonel Joseph Harper, of the 327th Glider Infantry, delivered the reply personally. The German lieutenant, baffled by the word, asked what it meant. Harper told him, in plain English, that it meant, "Go to hell." He added, "If you continue to attack, we will kill every German that tries to break into this city." Outside Bastogne, the German artillery resumed. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne, 10,000 fighting men plus thousands of attached troops, dug deeper into frozen foxholes around the town and waited for the relief that everyone knew could not come unless the sky cleared. While Bastogne held, the rest of the German offensive plunged west. The 2nd Panzer Division, the lead element of Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army, bypassed Bastogne to the south and raced toward the Meuse River near Dinant. The Panzer Lehr Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, the 116th Panzer Division, all pushed west, each kilometre measured against a fuel gauge that crept downward and never refilled. Above them, day after day, the sky did exactly what the German meteorologists had said it would do. It stayed grey. Fog filled the valleys. Sleet hissed against the trees. From December 16 through December 22, Allied tactical air forces were largely grounded. The fighter bombers sat on muddy airstrips in Belgium and France. The medium bombers stayed in their hangars. The 8th Air Force's heavy bombers struggled to find targets through the overcast. By the standards of late 1944, the air forces flew a fraction of their normal sortie rate. The Germans had their week. Behind American lines, in a small French town named Nancy, a different kind of preparation was being made. On the morning of December 8th, before the offensive even began, Lieutenant General George Patton had picked up the telephone in his 3rd Army headquarters and called for his chief chaplain, a Catholic priest named Monsignor James Hugh O'Neill. Patton's voice was direct. He asked O'Neill if there was such a thing as a good prayer for weather. He said they had to do something about the rains if they were to win the war. O'Neill, a 52-year-old Irish-American priest from Chicago, searched his missal and could not find one suitable. So he wrote his own, on a 3x5 filing card, in neat capital letters. The prayer asked the Almighty and most merciful Father, in his great goodness, to restrain the immoderate rains with which they had had to contend, and to grant them fair weather for battle. It asked that the soldiers, armed with his power, might advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of their enemies. It ended with a quiet and very Catholic Amen. Patton ordered the prayer printed on cards, 250,000 of them, one for every man in 3rd Army, with a personal Christmas greeting from him on the reverse side. The cards were distributed to 3rd Army units in the days leading into Christmas. O'Neill also wrote and sent out, on December 14, what he called Training Letter No. 5, an instruction to the 486 3rd Army chaplains of more than 30 denominations, asking them to lead their men in prayer for fair weather for battle, for victory, for the army, and for peace. For 7 days after the German guns opened, those prayer cards sat in pockets and helmet liners. It rained, it snowed, it fogged. The Allied air forces stayed on the ground. Then, In the night of December 22 and into the morning of December 23, the weather changed. A cold, high-pressure system, often called a Russian high, swept westward off the Central European plain. Cold, dry air pushed in beneath the maritime air mass that had been hanging over the Ardennes for more than a week. Temperatures plunged. Overnight readings approached, and in some places passed 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Pressure rose. The fog, robbed of its moisture, simply dissolved. By early morning of December 23, the sky over the Ardennes was clear from horizon to horizon. At Allied airfields across Belgium, France, and southern England, ground crews who had not had a day's worth of operational weather in a week looked up and began running. Engines fired up across acres of tarmac. Bombers, fighter bombers, transports, gliders, and reconnaissance aircraft rolled out for takeoff. The avalanche the Germans had been told would not come now came down on them with a force that even Eisenhower's planners had not quite prepared for. In Bastogne, at around 9:55 in the morning of December 23, the first American aircraft over the surrounded town were small and unarmed. They were C-47 Skytrains carrying pathfinders of the 101st Airborne. Their pathfinders dropped into the perimeter, set up Eureka beacons, and called in the main wave. By midday, 241 C-47 transports, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts, came in over the rooftops of Bastogne and dropped 144 tons of supplies onto a drop zone between the villages of Sénonchon, Hemroul, and Savy. Around 95% of the payload was retrieved. Several C-47s were shot down by German anti-aircraft fire. More drops followed on December 24 and December 26, including gliders carrying surgeons and aviation fuel. The defenders of Bastogne, who had been rationing artillery shells to fewer than 10 rounds per gun per day, suddenly had ammunition again. For the German columns on the open roads of the Ardennes, the same clear sky was a death sentence. Between December 16 and December 27, the Allied air forces flew approximately 34,000 sorties over the battle area and dropped roughly 34,700 tons of bombs. The vast majority of those sorties came in the 5 clear days between December 23 and December 27. On December 23 alone, the Allies put up thousands of sorties against only a few hundred German aircraft that managed to take off. On December 24, the 8th Air Force mounted what it called an all-out effort, sending more than 2,000 heavy bombers in a single day against German rail yards, bridges, and supply dumps behind the front. The B-26 Marauders of the 9th Bomber Command flew more than 600 sorties on December 23 and over 800 on Christmas Day. On the ground beneath all this, a German tank commander could not move. He could not stop and refuel. He could not even step out of his vehicle. The narrow, twisting Ardennes roads were lined on both sides with fir trees and steep banks, leaving nowhere to disperse. P-47s of the 9th Tactical Air Command, Hawker Typhoons of the Royal Air Force, 2nd Tactical Air Force, P-51 Mustangs, sweeping ahead of the bombers, all hunted in pairs and flights along these roads. They strafed columns nose to tail. They put rockets into King Tigers. They left burning trucks, dead horses, and dead men in the snow. General Hasso von Manteuffel, after the war, told Allied interrogators in plain terms what those days felt like for his army. He said that from the 23rd and 24th of December onward, the Allied air forces operated freely. He said they found targets throughout the entire offensive area. He said bomb carpets fell on the roads and railways behind the front. He said the supply system, already inadequate, was throttled. He said the mobility of his forces decreased steadily and rapidly. The 5th Panzer Army's higher artillery commander, General Richard Metz, used an even bleaker formulation in his post-war account. He told his interrogators that the attacks from the air were so powerful that even single vehicles for the transport of personnel and motorcycles could only get through by going from cover to cover. Royal Air Force Group Captain Johnny Johnson, a famous Spitfire pilot, recorded one such mission in his memoirs. He led his squadron over a road near Houffalize, in what he later described as sparkling sunshine and unlimited visibility. He left behind, in his account, nearly half a mile of blazing, ruined vehicles. While the Jabos hunted on the roads, the German spearhead reached its high water mark. The 2nd Panzer Division, leading Manteuffel's drive, pushed through the night to a small village called Foy Notre Dame, just a few kilometers east of the Meuse River near Dinant. Around dawn on December 24, a reconnaissance battle group of the division reached its westernmost point there. The lead Panther struck a mine. The crews were out of fuel. They had pushed the limit of their 5 million gallons of gasoline. Just to their south, the Panzer Lehr division reached the village of Sels. Behind them, every road back to their depots was now under daylight air attack. The 2nd Panzer Division could not be resupplied, could not be reinforced, and could not pull back. On December 25, Major General Ernest Harman's American 2nd Armored Division, the Hell on Wheels, attacked from the north. British troops of the 29th Armored Brigade, holding the Meuse bridges, fired in support. By the evening of December 26, the 2nd Panzer Division, as an effective fighting force, ceased to exist around Sels and Foy Notre Dame in what the Americans called the Sels Pocket. Most of its remaining tanks were destroyed, 5 kilometers from the river, the tip of Hitler's offensive. That same evening of December 24, Manteuffel telephoned Hitler's military adjutant. He recommended that the offensive be halted and that the German army withdraw to the West Wall while it still could. Hitler refused. On December 26, the relief column from Patton's Third Army broke into Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division, having driven north more than 100 miles in 4 days under Patton's order to drive like hell, executed an armoured dash through the village of Assenois behind a 40 rapid-fire round artillery preparation. At about 4:50 in the afternoon, 1st Lieutenant Charles Bogues, commanding a heavily armoured Sherman tank named Cobra King, made first contact with engineers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 101st. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the future Army Chief of Staff, shook hands with Brigadier General McAuliffe shortly afterward. Bastogne was relieved. Patton, in his diary, looked back on the previous days and wrote, on Christmas Day, that it had been a clear, cold Christmas, lovely weather for killing Germans, which seemed to him a bit queer, seeing whose birthday it was. He summoned Monsignor O'Neill. He told the chaplain that O'Neill was the most popular man in his headquarters, and that he had stood in good with the Lord and the soldiers. He pinned the Bronze Star on him. For the Wehrmacht, the math now turned crushing. Hitler's generals had bet on 5 days of weather. They got those 5 days. But the offensive needed at least 2 such windows back to back, with intact captured fuel dumps in the middle, and instead it got a single window, a partial fuel resupply, and then a sky full of fighter bombers. The 6th Panzer Army on the northern wing had already been broken on Elsenborn Ridge. The 5th Panzer Army in the centre was being savaged from the air. The 7th Army on the southern wing, with no armour of its own, could only hold and bleed. On New Year's Day, the Luftwaffe spent its last reserve in a single morning. Operation Bodenplatte, originally planned for December 16 and repeatedly delayed by the very weather Hitler had wanted, finally launched at around 9:20 in the morning on January 1, 1945. Roughly 900 German aircraft, a mixed force of Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and a handful of jet aircraft, swept in low against 16 Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. They destroyed around 305 Allied aircraft and damaged about 190 more. The cost was the Luftwaffe itself. About 271 fighters were destroyed, with more damaged. 143 German pilots were killed in action, 70 were captured, 21 were wounded. Among the dead and missing were more than 60 experienced wing, group, and squadron commanders. The Allies replaced their lost aircraft within a week. The Luftwaffe never replaced its lost pilots. Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, Colonel Nikolaus von Below, would write in his memoirs that on that day a catastrophe befell the Luftwaffe. The bulge in the line that gave the battle its name began to shrink. By January 16, soldiers of the United States First Army, attacking from the north, met soldiers of Patton's Third Army, attacking from the south, at the small town of Houffalize. The 2 halves of the front had closed. By January 25, the German army was back, very nearly, on the line from which it had attacked on December 16. Hitler had already, on January 8, ordered the 6th Panzer Army out of the west to face the new Soviet offensive, which broke from the Vistula on January 12. The reserves he had spent in the Ardennes to win a negotiated peace in the west would now be missing in the east, where they were needed against the Red Army's drive on Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945. The cost was staggering on every side. For the German army, the campaign in the Ardennes consumed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Approximately 600 tanks and assault guns were destroyed, including most of the irreplaceable King Tigers committed to the battle. About 1,500 to 1,600 German aircraft were lost across the campaign. The strategic reserve of the Wehrmacht in the west was effectively annihilated. By early February 1945, the entire German Western Front could field fewer than 200 operational tanks. For the United States Army, the Battle of the Bulge became, and remains, the bloodiest single battle in its history. Approximately 600,000 American soldiers were eventually engaged. American casualties totaled roughly 81,000. Of those, official Department of the Army figures record about 19,246 killed in action. Roughly 47,000 were wounded. About 23,000 were captured or missing. Hundreds of American tanks and tank destroyers were destroyed. Beyond the bullet and the shell, the cold itself filled hospitals. Thousands of additional American soldiers were hospitalized for cold injuries during and after the battle, with trench foot, frostbite, immersion foot, and pneumonia. Across the fall and winter of 1944 to 1945 in the European theatre, cold injuries removed the equivalent of nearly 5 infantry divisions from combat strength. British forces, mostly engaged on the Meuse and the northern flank under the temporary command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, suffered approximately 1,400 casualties, of whom around 200 were killed. And the civilians of Belgium and Luxembourg, who had been celebrating their first Christmas in 5 years without the Wehrmacht, found themselves once again in the path of armies. At least 3,000 Belgian and Luxembourgish civilians died in the campaign. More than 100 were murdered by the Waffen-SS in and around Stavelot. American bombing of Malmedy on December 23, 24, and 25. The result of a tragic identification error in which American aircraft mistook the American-held town for German lines, killed around 200 more civilians and dozens of American soldiers. Belgian civilians were murdered at Bande, at Houffalize, at Parfondroy, at Renardmont, at Steur, in the slow trail of horror that followed German columns through villages where the killers believed there would be no witnesses. The verdict of the Wehrmacht's own surviving commanders was unanimous and bitter. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, asked after the war why the offensive had failed, blamed it on the Luftwaffe's inability to control the air. Of Hitler's grand objective of Antwerp, Rundstedt remarked privately, in a phrase later quoted by his interrogators, that if the Germans merely reached the Meuse, they should get down on their knees and thank God, let alone trying to reach Antwerp. Field Marshal Walter Model had told his planners at the start that the operation had not got a leg to stand on. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff of the 5th Panzer Army, would write afterward in his memoir Panzer Battles that the Ardennes battle drove home the lesson that a large-scale offensive by massed armour had no hope of success against an enemy who enjoyed supreme command of the air. In the privacy of his diary in the spring of 1945, Joseph Goebbels would lament that again and again the same starting point returned. The whole German military predicament, he conceded, was due to enemy air superiority. Today, the long shadow of those weeks lies across the Ardennes in stone and soil. In eastern Belgium, at Henri-Chapelle American Cemetery, nearly 8,000 Americans lie under straight ranks of white marble crosses and stars of David, with the names of more than 450 of the missing carved into walls of pale limestone. At Ardennes American Cemetery near Liège, more than 5,000 Americans rest, with the names of over 450 missing recorded on the tablets there. At Luxembourg American Cemetery in Ham, more than 5,000 Americans lie, including General George Patton himself, who asked to be buried with his men. Above the village of Bastogne, on a hill overlooking the road junction his men had refused to surrender, stands the Mardasson Memorial. Designed by Belgian architect Georges de Doyard, dedicated on July 16, 1950. It is shaped like a 5-pointed American star, 12 meters tall. Around its inner walls are inscribed the names of every American state. Carved into its stone is a number, a single terrible accounting. It records 76,890 Americans killed, wounded, or missing in the Battle of the Bulge. In a crypt below the star, 3 altars stand, one Catholic, one Protestant, one Jewish, beneath mosaics by the artist Fernand Léger. Each year, on cold December mornings in the Belgian and Luxembourgish forests, surviving veterans, then the children of veterans, and now the grandchildren of veterans gather at these places. They walk among the trees that are still scarred by shrapnel. They lay wreaths in foxholes that are still visible in the leaf litter of the Bois Jacques outside Bastogne. They stand silent at 6 in the morning in the cold, so they can know for one breath what the men in the 101st Airborne knew for 40 days. A weather forecast had been the cornerstone of Hitler's last great offensive. The forecast itself was not even wrong. The German meteorologists predicted bad weather, and bad weather came. They predicted that it would last around 5 days, and it lasted around 5 days. The trouble was not the prediction. The trouble was a strategic plan that demanded the weather perform a miracle, 2 windows of bad flying weather back to back, with a flawless German fuel and supply system in between, on roads through forests where the panzers could not leave the asphalt, against an Allied air force that, on its first clear day, could put up more sorties before lunch than the Luftwaffe could manage in a week. There is a quiet, particular lesson in that fact. It is not the lesson that bad weather is unreliable. The German forecast was reliable. It is the lesson that no nation, however brilliantly its officers fight, however dangerous its tanks, however well drilled its soldiers, can place the entire weight of its strategic future on a phenomenon over which it has no control. The Wehrmacht in December 1944 did not lose because its meteorologists failed. It lost because its leaders asked the sky for something the sky could not, in good conscience, provide. 5 days. 5 days of fog, then sunshine again, and the world's most powerful air force overhead, and a long, slow walk back through the snow. When the Allied airmen flew home to their muddy Belgian airstrips on the evening of December 23, 1944, they did not yet know they had won the battle. The fighting would grind on for more than a month. Men would freeze in foxholes. Boys from Iowa and Texas and Brooklyn would die in the Belgian woods on Christmas Eve. Belgian children would lose fathers to a war they did not start. But high above the Ardennes that afternoon, in air clean and cold and blue from horizon to horizon, the answer to Hitler's last great gamble had already been delivered. The fog had lifted, and once the fog lifted, the war in the West had only one possible ending. The German planners of Wacht am Rhein understood, as well as any soldiers in history, that men with engines and guns can be commanded. They understood that infantry can be ordered forward, that fuel can be rationed, that surprise can be achieved through discipline and silence. What they had to learn, in the first cold, sunlit hours of December 23, was the one thing no general can ever truly command. The weather above the battlefield does not take orders. It has no rank. It has no oath. It cannot be court-martialed for failing to obey a plan. For 70 years and more, that lesson has sat in the after-action reports and the staff college lectures of every serious military academy in the world. It is not a lesson taught with maps and statistics alone. It is a lesson taught at the edge of forests in eastern Belgium, where the trees still bear scars, and where, every December, a sky much like the sky of 1944 turns, in its own time, from grey to blue, indifferent to the men below who once asked so much of it.